Bryan Adam has been a member of the Scottish National Party since 1974. Mr. Adam is currently the SNP's chief whip. He was initially elected to the Parliament in 1999, which is when the Parliament first sat after nearly a 300-year break for the Northeast Scotland. In 2003, he was elected as MSP for Aberdeen North, and then in 2007, he was re-elected to the Scottish Parliament. Previously, he served as a councillor for Middlefield and Aberdeen. Prior to 1999, he was a principal biochemist in the National Health Service and a trade union activist. Born in Newmill, Banffshire, Mr. Adam received an honours in a bachelor's in science in biochemistry and a master's in science in clinical pharmacology from Aberdeen University. He and his wife are the parents of 5 children. They live in Aberdeen. They're active members of the church, and he's a keen follower of football, that is European football, or football for the rest of the world except the United States. Mr. Adam.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. First of all, can I do the product placement? I'm here for a number of reasons, but one of them is to thank BYU for sending so many fine young men and women to come and be interns in the Scottish Parliament. Some are here today, and some have went home and made some fairly significant decisions as far as my family is concerned, because the other reason I'm here is because my son is getting married to one of the interns. And for those of you young ladies who are thinking of perhaps interning in Scotland in the fall, I have a very eligible young man still available who is also interested in politics because he works for his dad. Right. Have I got that right? Yeah. That was basically what Dr. Dameron was telling you about. This photograph taken outside my parliamentary office, and it's slightly askew. I don't know whether that's... it shouldn't be that way. That's obviously the projector. For those of you who were here before the screen went down, there was a wonderful world map and the usual view of the world, which kind of focuses on Western Europe and the United States. I'd like to take a perhaps slightly different view, he says, here we go, of the world. Now, some of you might think that since I'm here to talk about politics, and the real politics these days is all about Iraq and Iran and those kind of things, that's why I've got the Middle East as the centre of the world. But the reality is, it's not Iraq or Iran that I want to talk about, it's Saudi Arabia. And why do I pick Saudi Arabia? Because that is the country Scotland will be sitting next to in the United Nations when we regain our independence. Scotland, of course, is not in the Middle East, despite the fact that we are one of the significant oil provinces these days. It's on the far northwest of Europe, and many people have a picture in their mind, if they know anything about Scotland, that it's cold, it's wet, it's always under a cloud, as you can see. And, of course, this is just a total myth. The reality is Scotland is a beautiful green country. No, we don't go and paint it. It is really like that. It's really like that. Not only is it a beautiful green country, it's an ancient country with a long and proud culture and history. Some of you might be familiar with some of it. But Scotland's culture and history has had a major influence in modern democracy. Many of the influences that you have started out in Scotland hundreds of years ago. Now, this is an unusual aerial photograph of Edinburgh. In the foreground is one of Scotland's iconic buildings, which is the Edinburgh Castle, built on top of a volcanic plug at one end of the Royal Mile. And in the background there is the new town of Edinburgh. Now, you can see it's laid out in grids, and there are crescents, and you think, well, perhaps they were copying what you do in the States. You lay things out in blocks. This was built in the 18th century. So for those of you who think that blocks and grids are an American invention, we also have some modern iconic buildings. This is the Scottish Parliament. We had a very interesting competition, an international competition to design the building, and a Catalan architect, no, not a Spanish architect, a Catalan architect from a devolved part of Spain was chosen to design the building. It has proved to have been extremely controversial. It was 10 times over budget and several years late. However, it is now the second most popular visitor attraction in Scotland. The Scots are coming to see just what all the money was spent on. The Royal Mile is a very important part of Edinburgh and indeed of Scotland. And at the top end is the Edinburgh Castle I was showing you. At the bottom end, we have the Parliament building, which is next to the Holyrood Palace, where the Queen, when she's working in Scotland, resides. Not when she's on holiday up in Balmoral, but when she's in Scotland to work. This is another shot of the Parliament. Now, you may see in the background there a wonderful hill with, the remnants of a Greek-type building. It's a folly. At one stage in the late 19th century, when there wasn't a lot of work, benefactors used to pay people to build things like this. There are a whole series of them all over Scotland, never completed, but it was a make-work job. But just below that, you can see some very fine old buildings. That was where most people in Scotland wanted the Parliament to be, up in Carlton Hill, not at the bottom of the Royal Mile, and certainly not looking like that. This is the inside of the parliamentary chamber. Rather different to Westminster. In Westminster, they sit opposite each other, 2 swords' lengths apart. This is to make sure they don't stab each other in the front. They're not too worried about stabbing each other in the back. But our chamber isn't very much in the European style of encouraging a conversation and rather than a confrontation. I'm not too sure if it's quite achieved that objective. There was an intention that we would have a different kind of politics from Westminster. We have tried, but not necessarily always succeeded. The chamber, actually, I think is a very fine building. I'm not so convinced about the outside. Shouldn't go denigrating what your own country, but the reality is it is controversial. Now, this is Scotland's new Parliament. That implies there was an old one. And as Dr. Dameron rightly pointed out, there was this slight gap, a little period of time when we didn't have any kind of Parliament at all. But Scotland had been an independent country probably for around 800-900 years, as an entity prior to the union of the parliaments in 1707. There were various attempts after 1707 either to reassert Scotland's independence or indeed to have some major measure of self-government for Scotland or Home Rule. Now, these 3 sets of words are very important because they're all positive: independence, Home Rule and self-government. If you remember those, I'll make some comment on that a little later, because this is the big debate in Scotland, the constitutional question. Part of the debate around changing the constitutional arrangements for Scotland led to the devolution settlement in the late part of the last century. It came about after a referendum held in Scotland, and the referendum was basically, do you wish there to be a Scottish Parliament, yes or no? And right up until 2-3 months before the referendum was to be held, that was to be the sole question. Mr. Blair unilaterally decided that he thought that wasn't the only thing that people should be asked about. He decided it would be a good idea if they asked the Scots whether this Parliament should have the power to vary taxes, read raise taxes. And, can you imagine a situation where Utah is really prospering, but the people in the northern part of the state really don't get on with people in the southern part of the state, and they decide they're going to have 2 separate states? And as part of the process of getting to that, folk are invited to decide whether they wish to allow the new legislature and the new governing arrangements the power to raise taxes. You know, I don't think anybody seriously would consider that the people would vote to allow taxes to be raised. So the answer to the questions were as follows, and in relation to whether there should be a Scottish Parliament or not, the Scots voted 3-1 in favour of it. And in regard to whether or not this new Parliament would have the ability to vary taxes, the Scots voted 2-1 in favour of that. So the Wrecking Amendment that was introduced in order to scupper it on the basis that, well, you can have your Parliament, but it's never going to raise any money, failed to work. So in 1999, the Parliament was restored. The lady whose photograph is in here is Dr. Winnie Ewing. She was a very distinguished, and is a very distinguished parliamentarian. She won a by-election to the Westminster Parliament in 1967 and served in a distinguished way both in Westminster and indeed in the European Union. And she had one term in the Scottish Parliament. She was the oldest member of the Scottish Parliament, so she had the privilege of reopening it. And the Scottish Parliament, which was adjourned, put into abeyance on the 25th of March 1707, is hereby reconvened. A momentous day in May 1999. How are people elected to the Scottish Parliament? Well, some of you might be familiar with the voting procedures for Westminster, where any number of candidates can stand for a constituency seat in Westminster, and the candidate who gets the most votes gets elected. Now, if you have 4 or 5 parties and they all have much the same sort of level of support, you can be elected as an MP for Westminster on 25, 26, 27% share of the vote. That actually happens. It still happens today. And considering the turnout is probably at best about 60%, you're being endorsed as the public representative with a fairly small share of the vote. And we do have 4 or 5 parties in some parts of the United Kingdom who regularly contest in a realistic way elections. So some people take the view, and this is the most generous view, that perhaps that's an unfair electoral system. And we ought to have a system that allowed all of the voices, all of the opinions to be heard in the Parliament, because after all, that's what a Parliament's for. It's to allow the people to be heard. So proportional representation was perhaps on that basis a good idea. The particular type of proportional representation that was chosen for the Scottish Parliament is basically the additional member system, which is used fairly widely in Germany. We still have constituency seats, first past the post. There are 73 of those. 56 further additional member seats, regional list seats, are dealt with through party lists, where people are invited to vote for the party of their choice, and through a combination of the share of the vote on that one and the numbers of people who are elected first past the post on the first one, the individuals are then elected to the regional list. So this, on the face of it, is a reasonably fair way of making sure all the voices in Scotland are heard, or so it would seem. Given that it's been deemed not appropriate for Westminster, despite the fact that we have the same kind of range of voices, those of us who are a little cynical perhaps might consider that there are other underlying reasons why that was chosen. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party have consistently said they do not want any form of proportional representation, but they have agreed to it for this Scottish Parliament. It could well be that if you work out that you've got 4 or 5 different types of voices, or 7 or 8, because actually in the last Parliament, at the end of the Parliament, we had 8 parties in the Parliament. You can perhaps imagine just how difficult it would be to create an overall majority for any one party in this Parliament. And I believe that's the real reason why we ended up with a proportional representation system. It was to prevent not just any party getting an overall majority, but one party in particular, my own. Nevertheless, I hope to show, not just looking at what happened in Scotland, because devolution has happened throughout the Celtic nations within Great Britain, but also how that system has been borne out in terms of actual votes, both in Northern Ireland, different kind of politics, but also a multi-party arrangement, and in Scotland, and how perhaps initially it did deliver all the voices, but didn't and hasn't prevented the kind of polarisation you normally see into big divides over the big question from actually happening. This is all the representations of the individual parties that are currently represented in the Parliament. My own party is the Scottish National Party, the SNP, the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish Conservatives, the Green Party, and Scottish Labour. And this is a copy of a ballot form that people were presented with last May. On the left-hand side, people were invited to vote for the party of their choice, and on the right-hand side, to vote for the individual of their choice in the constituency. Now, you can see it's maybe 7 or 8 on each side here. Well, in reality, in most regions, there were around 20 parties contested the election. And you can also see, for those of you who have got very good eyesight, that most of the parties who are described on the ballot paper there have all got Scottish at the beginning. There's the Scottish Christian Party, the Scottish Conservative Party, the Scottish Green Party, the Scottish Labour Party, the Scottish Liberal Democrat Party, the Scottish National Party, the Scottish Socialist Party, and then Solidarity. By the way, I should tell you where Solidarity comes from. In 2003, 6 socialists from the Scottish Socialist Party were elected to the Parliament. And as is the wont of far-left parties, they couldn't agree amongst themselves. The party leader was involved in a major sex scandal. He won a case against one of the more salacious Sunday newspapers, but his brothers and sisters in the party gave evidence against him in court, and the party split. So he set up his own socialist party, and of course chose the most appropriate name, Solidarity. However, as you can see, there's lots of Scottish parties you can choose from, and I'll come back to that later. This is the kind of numbers from each of the parties who were elected on each of the occasions. On the right-hand side, in terms of the numbers, the Labour Party were 56, went down to 50 the next election, and down to 46. Clearly a major party in Scotland, but whose fortunes are perhaps on the decline now. The Scottish National Party had 35 in the first Parliament, down to 27 in 2003, and in reality down to 25 by the time we got to the end of that process. But we're now in the dizzy heights of 47, having won by 1. The Tories and the Liberals, their numbers are much the same throughout, although both of them are just shading off at the moment. But you can see, in terms of the bottom two, that in the first Parliament there were 3 non-major parties represented in the Parliament. That went to 17 in the second Parliament, and then back down to 3 again. Now, I have a number of explanations for that. The first explanation is that people were not familiar with proportional representation in the first election in Scotland. It was something brand new. They were familiar with the major parties, and they continued to support the major parties. But we did get 1 socialist, 1 member of the Green Party, and someone that the Labour Party deselected and thought unfit to represent the Labour Party in the Scottish Parliament, but fit to represent the Labour Party in Westminster. So he decided to leave the Labour Party and stood as an independent and won the biggest majority in Scotland. And he continued to do that in 2003. We then get to the point in the second election. Now, part of this would be because people were now familiar with the idea of proportional representation, but it's also to do with, I believe, disappointment with the building and the fantastic cost of the building, a disappointment about some of the decisions the Parliament made. But we did have many more voices, and we did have a rainbow Parliament. We had 7 Greens, 6 Socialists, a Pensioners' Party, an independent Labour man, an independent nationalist. We had a anti-hospital closure candidate who was successful. And we've got, a big chunk of the Parliament no longer in the main parties. But by the time we got to 2007, you can see the figures there that we're back down to 3 again, and we've got a major polarisation within the Parliament along the lines of the big divide in Scottish politics. That is, do you favour Scotland being independent or not? And you may think that perhaps because the SNP had gone down to 27 in the second Parliament, the cause of independence was weakened. The reality is, in the first Parliament, we had 35 members of the SNP. We had 1 Green and 1 Socialist. The Greens and the Socialists are also nationalist parties. So there were 37 members of the first Parliament in favour of independence. In the second Parliament, despite the fact the SNP only had 27, we actually had 41 members in favour of independence. 6 Socialists, 7 Greens, an independent nationalist, and indeed some of the minor party people, although not openly nailing their colours to the nationalist banner, were broadly sympathetic. But nevertheless, there were 41. We went from 37 to 41 in the second Parliament in favour of the national question, the big divide, in terms of independence. And in the third Parliament, that number has gone up again. We now have 47 SNP members, 2 Greens, who are nationalists, but environmentalists first, and 1 independent nationalist. So we're now at 50. So the national question is key in terms of the election, and the polarisation within the country in terms of votes has become a little clearer, in spite of proportional representation. Sometimes perhaps because of it. Now, in Northern Ireland, and this looks like a real parliament, doesn't it? Stormont. They've had, I don't know whether the waving red hand of Ulster in terms of their flag is distracting or not, but they've also had 3 elections in broadly the same period of time. They have 5 main parties, 2 nationalist parties, 2 unionist parties, and a non-aligned, non-sectarian alliance party. What happened in Northern Ireland is they had experience of single transferable votes in their local elections. So in the first Parliament, in the first Parliament, there were 12 of their members that were not from the 5 bigger parties. There were 3 others, totally independent, 2 women from the Women's Coalition, and 2 separate minor unionist parties that had 7 members in total. The Alliance Party, 6, and that remains fairly steady throughout the course. And in the first Parliament, the 2 extreme parties, the extreme nationalists and the extreme unionists, they were the minor players. Sinn Féin on 18, the Democratic Unionists on 20, Social Democrat Labour parties and another nationalist party, they were bigger than the Sinn Féin in the first Parliament at 24, and the Ulster Unionists were the traditional party of government in Northern Ireland. They were on 28. By the time we get to the second election, the long tail has disappeared. The 12 is now down to 3. The Alliance Party still on 6, but the position of Sinn Féin and the SDLP is totally reversed. It's 24 to Sinn Féin and 18 to the SDLP in the second election. And you can see the 2 biggest parties have roughly half, which is approximately where they were at with the first one. And the DUP has replaced the Ulster Unionists, having 30 to their 27. And what happened this May? No tail anymore, still down at 3. The Alliance Party managed to get 1 more. The Ulster Unionists are now reduced to 18. The SDLP reduced to 16. Those are the moderate wings of unionism and nationalism. And the great bulk, of the seats are in the hands of the Democratic Unionists, the extreme end of unionism, and Sinn Féin, the extreme end of nationalism. So in spite of the proportional representation system meant to have all the voices heard, we still get polarisation on the big issue. And I think that's quite interesting. I'm not sure that proportional representation actually delivers what it says on the box, especially when it's designed to deliberately subvert any debate about the big issue. I think I've kind of covered that. That's the layout of the Scottish Parliament and the various parties. Where in Scotland are these parties representing? Well, these are the seats that are held by the four big parties in terms of the constituency vote, the first past the post vote. The Liberals sort of represent the rural fringe and most of the islands in the far north, relatively low populated areas. The Labour Party is totally restricted to the central belt of Scotland, where the big bulk of the population actually are. The Tories that are in blue, I don't think it's just a coincidence that they represent areas on the English border. By the way, the Tories' proper name in Scotland is the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party. But the Labour Party is a unionist party as well, as indeed are the Liberal Democrats. The SNP represent a lot of central Scotland. In each of the regions, there are 16 members of the Scottish Parliament, 9 from first past the post seats and 7 from the regional top-up list. The SNP have support right across Scotland. In each of the 8 regions, the SNP have significant representation. The smallest number out of the 16 that we have is 5, and it's in the south of Scotland, right along the border. And the highest representation we have is in the area I represent, in the northeast corner, where we've got 8 out of the 16 seats. And in order to get the 8 out of the 16 seats, we had to poll, I'm trying to remember the exact number. Do you remember, David? No, it's in the low 40%, because there are a lot of minor parties where there are 20 odd parties standing. Their share of the vote effectively gets discounted. So in order to get half the seats, you need half the votes that are counted. And to get to that, you need over 40% of the vote, and we did in fact get that there. Why did the SNP win this time? 70 years we've been in existence, and this is the first election that we've won. Well, lots of political pundits suggested it was thanks to Tony Blair. Thank you, Mr. Blair. The SNP, on every occasion he came to Scotland, put out the red welcome mat, because every time he came, our support rose. It is absolutely true to say that Mr. Blair was not popular in Scotland. But is that the real reason why we won? Well, perhaps. Most political pundits thought that was a significant contribution. Was it the Iraq War and the fact that, the SNP had been loudly and proudly against the war? And I think it would be fair to say that Mr. Blair did not carry the support of his own party, let alone his own supporters. That too was felt to be a big factor amongst the political pundits. But was it? Could it be that the SNP all of a sudden had become tremendously popular, and that well-read SNP manifesto with its 60, 70 pages full of promises, and I think we posted out 1 million of them, so perhaps some were read. Was that the real reason for it? We were promising a referendum on independence. We were promising to abolish the local council tax and replace it with an income tax. We were going to abolish tuition fees, no fees, free education. Does that sound like a good platform? Well, I think all of those things were probably true. But after the election, some academics at the universities of Strathclyde, Reading and Lancaster did an opinion survey as the reasons why people voted the way they did. Now, the campaign was absolutely characterised by the sort of presidential style of Mr. Alex Salmond, the party leader, who is a controversial figure in Scotland. People love him or they hate him. And this is because he is known as Smart Alec. He's always got a pithy quip for every occasion, a put down for every opponent, and he had a very significant makeover. He is now consensual Alex. He doesn't put down his opponents. He states his case. He listens reasonably to them, and he doesn't negatively campaign. The whole of the SNP campaign was founded on the principle that we will not attack our opponents. We will present an aspirational view of what Scotland could be like and how much we would like Scotland to move forward, and we will leave the others to do what they always do. The Labour Party always have a negative campaign. When we talk about independence, home rule, self-government, they talk about separation, divorce, and the breakup of the union, using beautiful visual images like broken windows and, and such like. And they also promised that every family in Scotland would be $10,000 a year worse off under the SNP. Aye. This worked for them. The negative campaign really bounced back on the Labour Party. Now, we're delighted to have discovered this is exactly what it was, but I think, to be fair, had we not had this research, we would have probably felt it was all the things that were in the previous slide. We also had significant voter management strategies. We had a survey scheme that identified where people stayed and their kind of purchase patterns, the Rust Belt, aged, and all the sort of things that I'm sure those of you who are political scientists here are aware of. We had that, and we asked the public 4 questions. And it's the sort of questions you would think they would be asked. Which party do you most closely identify with? That one was marked down. If they weren't standing, who would you vote for? What's your second preference? And the third one was, who do you plan to vote for in May? That went down. But the other question, and I think this really relates to my talk, was, if there were a referendum on independence tomorrow, how would you vote? Now, some people might have thought that was a bit presumptuous. Here we are, not a very well-funded party, although that changed during the campaign, quite a bit behind the Labour Party. What kind of confidence is this? We're asking folk about that. I'll perhaps return to that and maybe deal with it in terms of questions. But we also had another very effective part of our voter management strategy. The Electoral Commission in the United Kingdom governs how elections are run. And in its wisdom, it has decided that parties may describe themselves in a variety of ways. But you have to register that description, and you're allowed to register up to 12. And in the second election to the Scottish Parliament, when we had that long tail, when we had 17 non-mainstream members of the Scottish Parliament, some of those very effectively managed to persuade a significant section of the public that the vote for the regional list was actually a second preference vote. You can vote for the party you really want on the constituency vote, but you can have a second choice on the regional list. Now, that was never the intention of the authors of the thing, but it was really effective. The Green Party in Scotland went into the 2003 election with 661 members. That's across a population of 5 million. Now, with the best will in the world, if all of them were active, they were going to have a lot of difficulty in phoning people, knocking on doors, even delivering leaflets. So their tactic was to buy a lot of A-boards that had their party symbol on it, and this very, very simple message: second vote Green. And that's how they ended up with 7 members of the Scottish Parliament, only 600 members of the party. So we decided we needed to give the public a reason to vote for the SNP on the regional lists. And this comes back to the kind of presidential campaign that Mr. Alex Salmond ran. The choice that we made from our 12 descriptors was Alex Salmond for First Minister. We were letting people choose whoever they wanted to be their MSP for their constituency vote, but in terms of the regional list, we were inviting people to vote for who they wanted to be First Minister. And there is no doubt at all from the polling evidence that Mr Salmond was by far the most popular of the public's choices. So Alex Salmond for First Minister, a reason to vote for the SNP. However, given that there were 20 parties, most of whom described themselves as Scottish, having a name like Alec was a godsend, because at the top left-hand corner of every ballot paper, it was Alex Salmond for First Minister. Now, psephologists might tell you that being at the top of the ballot paper is probably worth 1%. And given that we won by about 1%, and we actually won by 1 seat, that might have been an extremely clever voter management strategy. Had the wording been the Scottish National Party, it would have been down in the middle at best, and perhaps near the bottom of that polling ballot paper. I suspect we would not have done nearly so well. In the first 2 elections, there was a significant attrition from the major parties from the votes that were cast in the constituency section to the votes that were cast in the regional section. Using this tactic, we all but made it disappear. In fact, interestingly enough, Mr Salmond stood in a seat for a constituency seat where the party was stirred a fairly long way behind the incumbent. But he's such a well-known figure that he, of course, won the seat from the Liberal Democrats. But people in his constituency had the chance to vote for Alex Salmond as the MSP for Gordon, and they also had the chance to vote for Alex Salmond for First Minister on the regional vote. And he was much more popular in terms of the regional vote than he was as the candidate for the constituency. And I'm pleased to say that since he's my neighbouring MSP, that I was the only one, I think, from the 9 constituencies in the North East that actually outpolled Alex Salmond for First Minister in terms of the constituency vote. I don't know whether that means he's less popular in my constituency than he is elsewhere, or whether I'm more popular than he is. But I'm not going to tell him that. So what's next on the road to independence? This one is just about 700 years too late. Well, not quite. Not quite. These are the MSPs who will deliver, we believe, independence for Scotland. If not in this particular Parliament, almost certainly in the next. These are Scotland's new campaigners for independence. Mr Salmond's in the centre there, and the lady to his right with the bright yellow blouse is the Deputy Leader, Nicola Sturgeon. We now have a minority government. Every day I start out at -18. I have to herd my 47 cats and make sure that they turn up. And in conjunction with the Minister for Parliament, we have to persuade 1 or 2 of the other parties to vote with us. Otherwise, we lose. And in the first few months, we only really lost 1 vote, and only 1 vote of any significance.